Hello and welcome to This Month in Security, Episode 6 from December of 2022. I'm Aubrey King with DevCentral, and today I'm joined by Aaron Brailsford from F5's Security Incident Response Team.
Like a lot of enterprise products that have existed for a long time, it's things bolted onto things, bolted onto things, bolted onto things.
And David Warburton from F5 Labs.
We still have millions of end-user systems to actually go and patch, and so it does feel like a very kind of asymmetric problem that we've got.
To end the year, we look back on some of our most crucial stories from 2022 and review a couple of our predictions from F5 Labs' 2023 predictions report. So strap on those earbuds and get ready for This Month in Security.
So we've had quite the year for security news in 2022. There's been no shortage of things being exploited in browsers, operating systems, server software, network devices, Internet of Things, of course. And we've had the extremes of things like 0 days in browsers, breaches in cloud services like Dropbox and LastPass. Software bill of materials was everywhere, and as if to prove why we need it, so were vulnerabilities in abandoned pieces of software like Boa Web Server that all sorts of products are still relying on. More than a year has gone by, and we are still talking about Log4Shell and its kind of offspring like Spring4Shell and the Apache Commons text vulnerabilities and their impact. And of course, ransomware has gone nowhere. It's becoming so common that some insurers are starting to talk about refusing to insure that risk, the risk of breaches and ransomware, because it's so predictable now. And I can't sort of intro the year gone by without talking about and giving a special mention to the CVSS 10.0 critical vulnerability that the 0 Day Initiative dropped right before Christmas in the Linux kernel. Which in the real world affects probably very few people. Fixes were available at the point it was dropped. In fact, they'd been available for a while. And the timing of the whole thing to me seems a tad disingenuous. But that aside, what I actually wanted to talk about from the last year was proxy not shell. We talked about this back in episode 4 of This Month in Security, around about when it came out, and we talked about the mitigations that Microsoft had put out. And exploitation was pretty well understood and discussed in the open at the point proxy not shell hit, which meant Microsoft had to rev their mitigation several times in the wake of it being disclosed and in the wake of it being fully understood. And then ultimately they released fixes in the November security update for Exchange. So you'd think it's done and dusted, right? Why am I bringing it up again? If you fast forward to the week before Christmas, proxy not shell came back. It came back when CrowdStrike noted that they were seeing the second stage of proxy not shell. Proxy not shell was two vulnerabilities chained together, like an entry point and then the final exploit. And they were seeing that second stage be exploited without evidence of seeing the first stage be exploited. They did some digging and some reverse engineering and figuring out through logs of how it looked like this had been pieced together. And what it looks like is that between November and December, sometime in December, someone has reverse engineered the fixes that Microsoft put out in the November security update for Exchange. And they have figured out one of the other vulnerabilities that Microsoft fixed. So Microsoft fixed several things. We'll concentrate on 3 of them if you're talking about this. Proxy not shell was 2 vulnerabilities chained together. And this new exploit is dubbed OWA SSRF by CrowdStrike, is the second half of proxy not shell with a new first half. And the new first half bypasses the mitigations that Microsoft put out for proxy not shell. It's a different endpoint that's being attacked. So proxy not shell was the auto-discover endpoint. OWA SSRF is the Outlook Web Access endpoint, hence the name. you would think, given that the amount of news Proxy Not Shell got back in sort of September, October, November time, and how bad it was, that everybody would have patched by now, right? The November security update's been out for over a month. Plenty of time for it to roll through patches. But what it looks like is that as of a week or so ago, there's about 70,000 exposed Microsoft Exchange servers out there who have the mitigations in place for Proxy Not Shell, so they were safe to that, but they haven't patched. So now they are all, once again, at risk of being popped, this time by OWA SSRF. Or repopped if they were popped in the first place by Proxy Not Shell. This, I think, for me, highlighted that mitigations are a great stopgap, but you shouldn't be relying on them long term, right? You know, fixes will come out, and for anything juicy enough, those fixes will be reverse engineered. And that means that you really want those fixes in place, because if someone reverse engineers the fixes, they will be looking for ways to get around the mitigations that were released, right? That's the first thing they're going to go looking for. They're also going to be looking because, let's face it, if fixes come out, those fixes, you can't avoid giving away what the problem was in the fix, right? Because you've had to change the piece of code that was the problem in the first place. So when a fix comes out, the faster you can reverse engineer it as an attacker, the better chance you have of finding servers out there that are still vulnerable to the thing, whatever that is, that you can then attack in that window between the fix being released and the patches being applied. And I say all that knowing how difficult it is to patch enterprise systems at scale. It's a big problem. And I'm not sure what the answer is, other than, those of us in security constantly banging on about the importance of patching, while knowing that it's really difficult in the real world.
For me, the funny thing when I read about this kind of resurgence, it reminded me of a time that I was sitting in a room with one of my customers from upstate at 3 a.m. With like 15 people sitting around a table and just trying to figure out the OWA IAP. I remember thinking to myself, wow, if there's something like systemic at the core of this thing, there are so many entry points for this one application. It would be very easy for someone to just change where they came from, and lo and behold, I mean, that's a great pick. It's something I think if anyone has done work on Exchange, that they'd really see, wow, this is super exploitable. And it also, made me think of David's point from a few weeks back when we were talking about Proxy Not Shell. This may be the thing that kind of really pushes people to migrate to the cloud and get away from some of this stuff, and really caring for some of these, these esoteric threats that they may not have the time to become security experts on.
Yeah, Exchange on-prem is a big hairy beast, right? It's very difficult to manage. It's very difficult to patch. It like you say, it's got a 1,000 different ways into Exchange, because it's like a lot of enterprise products that have existed for a long time. It's things bolted onto things, bolted onto things, bolted onto things. And all of the stuff still sits there to maintain backward compatibility with older clients. And, it's very hard for the vendor to close those holes, because if you turn a piece of functionality off that was only there to support, I don't know, an Outlook client from a decade ago, you can guarantee some customer was relying on that functionality. And you as an enterprise vendor are like, well, so I have to keep it around. That's a problem we all face. F5 faces that with pieces of functionality that are there simply to support legacy, stuff in classic big IP that's existed for since sort of 2005 at this point.
So I wanted to talk about quantum, partly because it's just a little kind of, I wouldn't say hobby, that's completely the wrong word to use, but like a pet kind of fascination of mine. It seems that everything these days is to do with quantum, if not machine learning. This kind of goes back to a story a bit earlier on in the year that Aaron covered about the vulnerability that was discovered in a post-quantum crypto algorithm called Psych. So I'll get back to that in a minute. But as I said, everything seems to be quantum at the moment. CERN, I believe, created the first black hole on Earth just a few weeks or months ago, which is all quite insane. We had our first fusion reaction to output more energy that we put in. We've got research that suggests that quantum mechanics are used in our brain. We've got quantum research, being interjected with machine learning. So the kind of possibilities of quantum mechanics and physics is just insane. But, to most of us, from a security point of view, we're going to be fascinated about quantum computing because it's quantum computing that poses a potential threat to the traditional security that we use on the web and pretty much in all our digital lives at the moment. So quantum computing, as a complete quick 101 refresher, differs very much from classical computers which uses logic gates, AND gates and OR gates to operate on bits, basically ones and zeros. Quantum computing is very, very different and takes advantage of a few different quantum mechanics, from superposition to entanglement and interference. And some of those are going to be important to understand why quantum computing and why the threat it poses to traditional cryptography is such a problem. So as I said, we've been talking about the threat that quantum computing poses to cryptography for a while. And first of all, I always like to kind of clear this up. People talk about quantum cryptography. Totally not a thing. Doesn't exist. There's no quantum crypto. What does exist is the use of quantum mechanics to exchange symmetric keys. And the reason that's useful is that we can exchange symmetric keys really, really securely. And then because of the properties of quantum mechanics, we know if someone's been essentially kind of eavesdropping. Because as soon as you measure an entangled element, you can detect that on the other side, basically. So that's a great way that quantum mechanics can be used for traditional crypto, but there is no quantum cryptography itself. So when we talk about quantum crypto, what we really mean is either the use of quantum for key exchange or the use of quantum computing to then go and break traditional crypto. So the idea is that a sufficiently large quantum computer can break asymmetric crypto. And that's another point to remember as well. Our symmetric crypto, so once we've done that initial key exchange, symmetric crypto is believed to be reasonably secure, even from quantum computers. They're not significantly quicker, if at all, than traditional computers from essentially just trying to perform an exhaustive key search, like a brute force attack on a symmetric key. So the real problem it poses are to the things like RSA and Diffie-Hellman key exchanges. They're the real problems. Quantum computers will make traditional crypto vulnerable. But to me, I think the really interesting point isn't just the lack of confidentiality. It's not the encryption itself. It's the bigger implication about trust and identity, which quantum to me is going to be a much, much bigger problem. Because ultimately, if you think about the ability for quantum computers to break or forge signatures, everything's out the window. There is no trust. There's no identity. You cannot possibly guarantee you'll go into a legitimate site because the certificate could have been forged. Code signing can be completely forged. There'll be all that element of trust and veracity is out the window. So where are we with quantum computers? Well, we've heard about qubits. I'm sure most of us have heard about qubits anyway. Following IBM's really quite impressive track record, back in 2016, they had a whopping 5 qubits in their quantum computers, which is all fairly tiny. But you fast forward through the years, in 2019, they went up to 27 qubits. 2020 saw 65 qubits. 2021, 127. And then last year was 443. Now, next year, they're projecting to release the first quantum computer with over 1,000 qubits at 1,221. Now, there are other systems with much greater qubit counts, about 5,000, a machine called D-Wave, I believe, or from D-Wave, I should say. But they're very specialized quantum computers. What IBM's creating is a generic and kind of versatile quantum computer that can be used to process a number of algorithms. And that's the key thing, because to break RSA and Diffie-Hellman, we require the use of running what's known as the Shor's algorithm. And it's that which effectively breaks RSA and Diffie-Hellman computers. IBM are also projecting a 4,000 qubit computer by 2025. And it's that kind of level that starts to get a little bit worrying because to factor a 2048-bit RSA key requires around about 4,000 qubits. Generally speaking, you kind of double the RSA key length to kind of find out how many qubits in theory you need to break that. Now, the performance of quantum computers isn't just about the number of qubits. It absolutely does relate to qubits, so it revolves around sort of scale and how many qubits you can have in any one quantum computer. It also relies on the quality, integrity, because there are many faster or quantum computers with a much higher qubit rates, but have much more noise and therefore much lower kind of quality of processing. And then you need the traditional speed. It's not just about qubits. We're talking about kind of specialized gates in quantum computers, and it's the speed of those gates which is also really important. So the kind of current estimation, I believe, is that when we get to around about 1.17 megaqubits, it will take around about 100 days to crack 2K key. So these things aren't around the corner, but the progress that IBM have made has been exponential. I actually plotted the few values they had, and it shows an almost perfectly exponential kind of rate. So these things are growing at an insane kind of rate. So if anything, if we need to learn anything from previous examples, is that technology, doesn't slow down. It doesn't follow a linear path. It does progress generally quicker than we think. So what are we doing about this as an industry? Well, NIST years ago kicked off a post-quantum program to look at algorithms that would be safe against quantum computers. They started off with about 69 proposal or candidates in 2017. They whittled it down to 26, and we're now down to 4. And it was one of those which made the story, made the news kind of headlines a few months ago that Aaron mentioned, called CYC, which stands for Super Singular Isogeny Key Encapsulation. And I will say nothing for cryptographers if that they're not brilliant at coming up with really cool, futuristic sounding names for things. So sounds awesome if nothing else. But turns out it's trivially crackable. I believe a single CPU core could crack the algorithm in hours. When researchers looked at it, it was a purely kind of mathematical based attack. But what's interesting is that technically the attack is on the algorithm, not the kind of method of key exchange. So the attack's on super singular isogeny Diffie-Hellman, which for all intents and purposes means that CYC is vulnerable because CYC uses the SIDH algorithm. So it's still essentially the same sort of, same difference basically. I think what's really worrying and really interesting about this is that it took this algorithm getting down to the final 4 for researchers to really poke at it and find this kind of vulnerability. Jonathan Katz, an IEEE member and professor of the Department of Computer Science at the University of Maryland, was speaking to Ars Technica, and he was quoted as saying 3 of the 4 post-quantum crypto schemes rely on relatively new assumptions whose exact difficulty is not well understood. And that's the key, I think. We take the security of RSA and Diffie-Hellman, we believe them to be secure. We believe there is no efficient polynomial time way of kind of cracking those. And similarly, we're now coming up with algorithms that we need to try and trust and believe are secure, but could take some time to find, academically or mathematically provably secure algorithms. So we're down to the final 4, arguably down now to the final 3 algorithms, and it remains to be seen whether the final 3 left will stand the test of time and remain to be kind of secure. I'm sure most people kind of appreciate that, as I teased at the start of this, if we get to a stage in, could be a few years, maybe up to 10 years, before we have a sufficiently large quantum computer to break traditional crypto, the implications are massive. Everything from web security, as I said, to code signing. But I think for me, it's the kind of physical devices which pose the biggest risk. It's medical devices, operation technology, IoT devices that have been put out on the internet or placed into our kind of hospitals that struggle to kind of get patched and updated to mitigate fairly trivial vulnerabilities and problems. Having to then implement brand new crypto libraries and algorithms, in some cases will bring the machines to very slow performance. Might even need possibly new hardware to make them work properly. And those devices, as we've seen, are very difficult to update in a timely and cost-efficient manner. So we've got 2 kind of problems that quantum computing poses at the moment. One is that quantum computing can and will break RSA and traditional Diffie-Hellman key exchanges. The other risk is that we're kind of arguably, I wouldn't say rushing, but if we go too quickly, we run the risk of standardizing on a new algorithm that turns out to be insecure in a few years' time, and we're in a pretty bad state. Now, the current kind of advice to kind of cope with the quantum computing world and the risk it poses to crypto is to generally double key sizes for RSA and Diffie-Hellman kind of key lengths. What's interesting is that will absolutely buy us time, but whilst the world has been generally moving to elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman because it offers a very similar level of security to RSA, the actual key sizes are much smaller. Now, when you consider how quantum computing works, that's really fascinating because actually the fact that Diffie-Hellman uses significant, or elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman uses significantly smaller key sizes means that it is potentially far more vulnerable to quantum crypto than RSA. So we could see a temporary shift back with the industry moving to much larger RSA keys, for example, 6 or 8K keys, as a kind of short-term stopgap until we find a truly tried and trusted, reliable method for implementing a post-quantum mechanism or algorithm. What's interesting is President Joe Biden's recently signed the Quantum Computing Cybersecurity Preparedness Act, which is a bit of a mouthful, just before Christmas on December 21st. It doesn't have an awful lot of teeth in it, but it is essentially asking government organizations to at least take a good inventory of all systems that rely on traditional crypto so that when the time comes to switch, organizations are at least aware. Going back to Aaron's topic around the kind of exchange vulnerabilities, half of these issues are to do with just visibility and organizations just not knowing these systems are out there. They've maybe forgotten they've deployed a system. So having a good inventory is going to be important. But one of the other requirements that the Act has is that organizations implement the post-quantum crypto algorithms within a year after they've been finalized. So it should hopefully force organizations to perform the patches and get them updated, just as long as they know where those systems are.
You talked about how fast, relatively fast. IBM is increasing the number of qubits in their quantum platforms, and the way it's doubling every year or so just brought me back to Moore's law.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that was true for transistor counts in classical computing for a very long time until we sort of started to deviate from it. It's interesting to go back to a place where that kind of doubling of computational density, I guess, is true again. And that race that you mentioned between how secure our crypto is and how many qubits there are available to break it is going to be a really interesting one. I think given how slow we tend to be to adopt new standards as an industry, as a world, I suppose, I'm not sure I fancy our chances in that race. I mean, you made me think about, let's say, SHA-1, right, which has been deprecated for a long time, and yet this recently, anyway, 2005, it hasn't been considered secure since 2005. NIST formally deprecated it in 2011, disallowed its use for digital signatures in 2013, but we declared that it should be phased out by 2030, which, last time I checked, is still some distance in the future. It's such a long timeline to make those changes, and that's before you get to, like you said, Internet of Things devices that can't be patched either because they've been abandoned or because implementing anything stronger is going to make them grind to a complete halt. It's going to be an interesting landscape change, and I think it's going to be hard to keep up with both technically and practically.
Yeah, I think something you mentioned, I think, was the kind of availability of these systems. We're not all we won't all be ending up with quantum computers in our server rooms, let alone our bedrooms or offices, home offices. But what's interesting is that everything's available as a service these days, from phishing kits to quantum computers, as it turns out. IBM and Google, I believe, have their own quantum computers as a service. So, we don't need for these to become financially or widely available to ourselves. We can just go and use these systems in the cloud, which is fantastic for researchers, people who want to do modeling of nature or weather systems or crack RSA algorithms. And it obviously means that whilst you can just go and rent a quantum computer for a number of hours or days to perform the benign or malicious kind of activities, we still have millions of end user systems to actually go and patch. And so it does feel like a very kind of asymmetric problem that we've got.
So for any of our listeners or viewers out there who are unfamiliar with quantum computing, I'm certainly no expert, but I would highly recommend that you just take a look at what what quantum entanglement means and try to imagine, I guess, the implications to things like algorithms. So that would be kind of my thing. Otherwise, if you don't want to do that, you can continue to feel like you are lost in F5's new mega encabulator, which is forthcoming. Now, for me, when I took a look at 2022 and all the stories that we covered, for me, I came into this role 6 months back and really started to focus on more of the security news. I definitely had a lot of catch up for, kind of getting up to speed with where Aaron and David are. But one of the things that really caught my eye was the software supply chain security threats that we have. Throughout the year, we covered, time and time again. There were different groups or organizations that took over, software repositories and things of that nature, or were able to gain widespread footholds very quickly in terms of an attack surface for whatever goal they were going after. To me, that is really kind of terrifying. And one of the things that we talked about was, also the fact that we have these stores. I think a lot of us have come to trust our tablets and, our smartphones and things of that nature. And one of the things that makes us trust those is the fact that they have these stores, which are kind of, they don't allow for malware to be spread very easily. So we did talk a couple of times about app signing keys being compromised throughout the year, and really kind of talked a little bit about what happens if we find some bigger application vendors that are maybe compromised and have been able to spread applications in these stores. Well, we found just that, and a couple weeks back, at the beginning of December, Tika Nagi from the Security Incident Response Team reported on This Week in Security about, I guess, what would be maybe the worst possible thing. One of the OEM vendors being compromised for the Google App Store. Now, it turned out to be much more than just one. The one name that he put out there was a pretty big one, and that was Samsung. Now, when I did the digging into this, reading the article and trying to do a little bit more research on it, it turns out that a number of different vendors were also part of this find. And I should say that hats off to Google Android security teams. I think it's Lucas, and I'm going to destroy this one, Cheversky, I believe, and Lucas. If I've mispronounced it, please correct me. I'm happy to take correction. But some of the other vendors that were on that list were LG, MediaTek, as far as heavy hitters, and also one that you may not know, which is, oh my gosh, my autocorrect went to Sirocco on that, but it is not. It's Sirocco, Czroco. And it's funny, as a Volkswagen fan, I do enjoy my Siroccos as well. But Sirocco, which, if you don't know them, they make the Walmart One tablets, and as you can imagine, that's something that is fairly widespread out there on the planet. So, what are the implications of this? Right, this means that any OEM software from any of those vendors can be injected with malware if somebody has that signing key. So they can essentially upload new software into the store, and it will be in Samsung's repository or LG's portion of the store. So anyone who is not up to date on the latest version of Android is going to be out of luck and could have software which has been compromised. Now, where this story gets even stranger is, and this is why I selected this one as sort of a culmination of some of the other things that we've spoken about. Labs has brought quite a bit of documentation through the Sensor Intel series about kind of back in time sort of attacks that have caught my eye as well. Well, this one's not that far back in time, but 6 years is how long ago Google has found infected portions of software from these OEM vendors. So 2016 is when Samsung apparently was exposed. So we have had 6 years of Samsung Android apps which have had malware. And what does this mean? Well, malware from an OEM vendor is a little bit different than malware from a software vendor. If you're unfamiliar, a software vendor is going to be not able to gain as much on your end user device because it is kept in check by system controls. Now, with an OEM vendor, you have a little bit of room. This isn't like a rootkit on a computer, a system, but it gives you privileges that allow you to change certain elements in the system configurations. So anyone who's got these keys is able to do things like screen record an Android machine, and you would never know the difference. You're just using your OEM Samsung application or version of Android. So to me, this is the one that I think, even though it's right at the end of the year, I feel almost like an American football prognosticator talking about, like this is kind of my, I guess my sort of high risk bet, I guess, as far as the level of importance of this one. But for me, it was the most important one to me, only because it brought so many of the different elements that I've talked about with you guys for the past 5 months and now 6 months to light for me.
It really kind of just brings some of that really old, like almost cliched saying now in security, which is the only secure system is the one that's turned off or is never accessed by a human. I mean, there are just so many ways that devices can be compromised. The amount of content we put, personal content, corporate content on mobile devices is insane. It's everything. We have everything on these devices. We saw in the US recently, TikTok's now banned, albeit only on government-issued devices, I think, or for members of Congress. I don't understand the full implications. But clearly you're kind of seeing various risks of these mobile phones. And I mean, clearly Congress people shouldn't be using personal devices or maybe having TikTok on corporate devices or government-issued devices. But the fact remains there are just so many different ways in which these systems can be compromised. And once they are, it's everything up for grabs, from passwords to intellectual property, everything. It's really quite scary.
Yeah, that supply chain problem is such a hard nut to crack. It's, code signing, right, that's the be all and end all of whether or not what you're about to install is legitimate or not. And right now, I guess we're lucky in so much as the bad actor has to steal those keys, most likely, right? But if we circle back to the quantum cryptography from earlier, they soon-ish might not have to steal those keys. They could just forge them.
So another portion of our show today is not just to look back at the past year, but as we're coming up on New Year's, and 2023 is, just a day and change away. We wanted to take a look at what 2023 might bring to us. And both Aaron and David participated in work on a labs project that is the predictions for 2023. Based on what we're seeing out there in the field, what do we think are going to be some of the bold predictions that might be out there? And we're going to run through kind of our tops and give you a link in the description to however you are consuming this month in security. We wanted to kind of highlight a few of these and then leave you with a link if you wanted to learn a little bit more. The first one that we all kind of talked about was the second item on the piece, which is that multi-factor authentication will become ineffective. Now, I wanted to start with this one because to me, this one is kind of funny. Becoming ineffective. I think ineffective is a strong word about this. We've seen a number of different things that have kind of gone awry this year with multi-factor authentication. But for me, that is ineffective is a hard one. I think it will definitely change. But David, I think you had some other thoughts on this one as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult creating a predictions piece. Everyone wants to kind of go crazy, go wild, predict the next huge thing that no one could possibly have thought of. And that's very likely not going to come true. Equally, some of the predictions pieces in the past have played it far too safe and said, oh, security is going to get harder. So we've tried to kind of land somewhere in the middle and basically base the predictions that we've put into the article on evidence, on things that we've been seeing over the past year or so, things that we've been seeing growing. And MFA bypass and MFA kind of interception techniques has been on the rise, almost exponentially. So I forget what I put in the article, useless or ineffective, but it's hard to think that it won't become almost useless. If you look at the number of ways in which multi-factor can be bypassed, right? We've got mobile malware, which can, intercept SMS messages. It can screen read, it can capture cookies, it can capture credentials as you enter them. We've got real-time phishing proxies, which are able to effectively bypass any multi-factor system because the proxy is mimicking and interacting with a live site. So it doesn't need to collect credentials and then reuse them a day or a week later. It's intercepting everything that's entered into that browser by the user in real time. So the user will enter their multi-factor code into the phishing site and it immediately gets sent to the real backend site where the MFA code is still valid. We've seen MFA bombing. So the idea now that when we have our mobile devices, because we want to make security easier, we want to remove that hindrance, that hurdle for users. Instead of having them enter a really complicated 6-digit code, let's just give them another iPhone or Android notification. So now our MFA apps are popping up notifications. Did you really mean to sign in? Is this you signing in? Now, if we get one of those notifications as we're logging in, fantastic. And if we're not getting it, if we get a notification when we're not logging in, that's also fantastic. We can happily click no and report an issue to our IT security people. But when we start getting bombarded with security, or MFA pop-ups, or maybe when we're multitasking, as we're all doing, and maybe not paying attention, there's a good chance we'll hit yes to that MFA authentication when we didn't mean to. And attackers know this, and they're relying on it. They're relying on this bombarding and overwhelming notification system, so that in effect, you will accidentally click yes at some point, and it might take them 100 attempts or 1,000 attempts, but it will succeed. So again, if you look at all the number of ways in which multi-factor is being technologically and socially engineered around, it's hard to see that MFA will ever be a complete solution. I mean, it was always a bit of a kind of increasing that barrier to entry, right? Increasing the difficulty for attackers. And now they find pretty useful and consistent ways of getting around it. So I think we're going to need to, almost to your point, Aubrey, we're absolutely not saying that MFA is useless. We're not saying that MFA shouldn't be used. It definitely should be. But I think it's really important for organizations to understand the limitations of their MFA system. Understand how easy it is for SIM swapping to capture SMS codes or to be read. What are the limitations or problems that real-time phishing proxies cause? So understanding these limitations is going to be key. And I do think we're going to need probably a bit more technology to help us improve our identity and authentication online. And we're hoping that the FIDO's passkeys solution will help raise that barrier significantly in the coming years.
You mentioned the MFA bombing, and I agree. I don't think MFA is going to go away, and I don't think it should go away. It is better than nothing, and it's right now it's essentially all we've got. But we don't help ourselves. Like you say, we decided that a 6-digit passcode was far too difficult for our users, so we enabled push notifications. Now, as much as I roll my eyes every time I have to actually open, an authenticator app and get the 6-digit code, I'd kind of rather we went back to that. Because the push notifications, at least I can't speak for anybody else's experience, we're almost training our users to fall for those MFA fatigue attacks. Because you can start your machine after updates or whatever and have 5 different things in a row all prompt for MFA. And those 5 things will all come through to your phone. So you're quite used to going, accept. Oh, I must need another one, right? Accept. I've had, I assume, bug recently that probably only affects Android, where I'll click approve and the prompt doesn't go away. And, every time that happens, so did it not go away, or is that another prompt? Is it a prompt from something I should be saying yes to, or is it a prompt from something I shouldn't be saying yes to? It's impossible for the user to know, so it's no surprise people fall for those attacks. But like you say, any solution that involves that challenge and response There will always be a way to gather that challenge and the response and then use it for your nefarious purposes. So we need something that doesn't rely on that to come along and supplant MFA.
I would agree with you wholeheartedly on the push notifications. I remember the first time I ever saw that, was Jesse Driscoll. Jesse, if you're out there, showed it to me and went, "Oh, this is fantastic." And I went, "Oh man, that looks like a nightmare to me. That could be really bad." And I didn't know how, but it just didn't look like. Although I was happy to install it and start using it on my phone too. So it was super easy. And finally, we understand, I guess, the ramifications now regarding that. So I think that one of the things that I mentioned when we talked about one of these MFA bypasses over the past few months is maybe moving towards not thinking of multi-factor authentication as two-factor authentication. It doesn't always have to be two factors. On a couple of my advanced customers, when I was still doing the sales thing, sales engineering, I used to prescribe 3 to 5 factor authentication anytime I could. And I think that is something that needs to be the new normal.
I will partly corroborate that and also contradict it. I think because going back to the kind of MFA prompts, right? So much about security that's overlooked is around user experience, user interaction. We're going back to MFA notifications. We could look back to the old school SSL and TLS warnings we used to get in our browsers that just meant nothing to users at all, and you could click a button and go past it. So we're training users to kind of bypass warnings. We're overwhelming them with nonsensical messages. So additional factors, I definitely agree, but I think probably the additional factors will have to be automatically derived.
Yes.
They shouldn't necessarily require a user to do an additional thing. So it will be the likes of, behavior analytics or device analytics, user interaction. So it requires kind of server-side tech and maybe some client-side tech to not only inspect the device, but see how the user's using it. Are they really a human user? Are they some kind of automated bot user? Has that same user fingerprint been detected across a number of devices from different IPs, which is weird. So I agree on the multiple factors, but they don't and probably shouldn't be user inputted factors.
One of the other pieces that we wanted to talk about was that open source software libraries will become the primary target. We saw these attacked a number of different times over the past year in a number of different ways. Some of these have been extraordinarily creative. So, if you're used to using Git, or you are used to having access to your favorite open source library that's going to make your program a little bit better, if you're out there coding securely, you may need to revisit some things with some of the latest hacks. Now, Aaron, you had some thoughts on this one, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so this is in the 2023 predictions, but you're right. We've seen this a lot. I would say predominantly in the latter half of this year. So it's accelerating, and it's such a rich target. Modern software, modern applications is built with layers and layers of libraries, and there is a temptation as a developer to just go find the thing that does the thing that you want and bring it in, right? It requires very little thought and introspection, and your goal as the developer is to finish your product or the piece of functionality you're working on. And you want to do that quickly and, in a relatively secure fashion. To really audit all of the things that you pull in every time you pull something in, some of these libraries are big. You're asking a developer to go and, who might not be a security expert, to go and audit thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of lines of code that he's pulling in. I feel like we need a different approach, but I'm not sure what that approach is. I could see that, if you make those libraries smaller and smaller, obviously there are limits, right? Some of these are big things like OpenSSL, huge project, Apache. It gets pulled into all sorts of products, and maybe not necessarily as a library, but certainly as a component. But pulling in smaller functional sets of code would at least make things slightly more manageable. We're never going to get away from from libraries and code reuse, and we probably shouldn't. It's what gives us huge efficiency gains. But it's a big problem. And yeah, I don't see a great answer. I think, and I said this in the predictions article, I think software bill of materials, SBOMs, is going to give us a leg up on at least identifying what we're using now, because that too is a problem, that losing visibility of all of the things that we've consumed into the products that we already created. But SBOMs aren't going to fix the problem of, a Python module being stolen or ownership being taken by a malicious actor and then malicious code inserted into that, and then you consuming it. An SBOM will tell you consume it, and therefore you can figure out that you're using something that has been popped, but it doesn't help you secure it on the front side. The only way I can see to do that is to make what we consume smaller and more easily understood, and to be more introspective when we consume it.
I think, for me, open source and library kind of attacks are fascinating because, again, it's, threat actors can spend hours, days, or weeks attacking one endpoint and one application for one customer or one victim. You attack a software library and you've potentially affected thousands, tens or hundreds of thousands of people. So for them, economies of scale are fantastic. There are two main targets I see from a software library and a kind of code reuse point of view. The one is those legitimate code libraries being infected with malicious code. So it could be developers having their credentials stolen, MFA bypassed, or any of those things. And that's a significant problem. We've even seen, hacktivists deliberately infected their own code. So even software developers aren't necessarily entirely above board. But the other side to me is the more almost just as difficult in theory to protect against, which is developers using illegitimate code libraries, because they might just be searching PyPy or some other GitHub or code repository for library which performs some function, and they'll find something and what brilliant, let's import it. Sometimes it might be a library that's been malicious library that's been deliberately named to look or sound just like a legitimate library. For a lot of developers, as we said, that just want to get on and do their job and get this functionality, great, import library, get on, do your job. So there's those two kind of very different style of threats, if you like. But I think to Aaron's point, I'm not sure how you really deal with it ubiquitously other than just having a kind of accurate inventory of all libraries. Now, that really should be automated in some way. And I think it's only having some way in, auditing or cataloging and auditing those libraries that will then allow you to at least retrospectively go back and check, do these libraries, are they from the publisher that you trust? Do they conform to some name standard or maybe code signing, some other kind of certificates? I think inventory and visibility is going to be key.
I think Tafara described this as Russian dolls when we were talking about one of these attacks. If you're, and for me, if anyone's having a hard time understanding how this could impact you, well, I don't build code. I don't install software from source. I don't do that kind of thing. Well, but you do install open source projects or software on your machine in some way, whether it's Windows or Linux or Mac. There are open source libraries that are used, or even worse, to Farah's point from a couple months back, you may have one library that relies on another library. So the library you think you're relying on may have the compromise somewhere else in, say, a sub-library, if you will. So to me, this one is definitely a worthy one to take a look at. Thanks for listening to episode 6 of This Month in Security for December of 2022. Happy New Year, community, and have a great day.